Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the Oraculo's True Divination podcast, where I bring you ancient wisdom for the modern mystic. I'm your host, Michael A. Bryan. Today's date is the 16th of February 2020, and the current local time is 4:30 p.m., and I am recording for you live from sunny Nassau, Bahamas. So, before we begin, I feel like I should just kind of give an explanation for where I've been because I have completely been MIA for, I dare say, the last 3 months or so. And in that space of time, I really got a deep sense of awe and even reverence and admiration for you guys on YouTube who actually come to YouTube weekly and pour out content. It takes so much, and it took so much from me to actually make these videos and put them together and schedule the time to make sure this happens. And I have like mad respect for anyone who's able to do this and do this consistently, because this really is a labor of love. Now, in that 3 months period, I came to the conclusion that I should do things a bit differently. So this is my first time doing this actually with a full screen of you able to see me and you able to see me talking. And I was a little bit intimidated about this because I don't have the proper camera equipment and I don't have the proper lighting and I don't have anything that actually says that I have the setup to create the sort of podcast experience that I would like to create. But I just said, you know what, dude, just do it. Because at the end of the day, what's most important is the content and the fact that the content is out there and the fact that there's a moving head to go along with the content and not just, some voice in the background, which was the previous videos. So I'm probably going to delete them and just swap them out with more videos of me live giving these live readings. So today, I'm going to dive right into the body of a horary chart that I did for a lady. And all of the charts are confidential, so there is no name attached to the charts at all and no identifiable information. So we're going to go into this chart of this anonymous person, and I'm going to show you how I move through the landscape of it. Because for me, in my journey with Horary Astrology and also with just being a spiritual consultant in general, and in all the various fields of my spiritual practice, I've always yearned deep down to be able to see how it's done and to be able to really look over the shoulders of someone who's gone through the ropes and someone who's actively in the field pumping out the work each and every single day. And I figured that this would be a good thing to do to not only bring you into the realm of my own practice as a consulting horary astrologer, but also for you guys who want to get into this field to also be able to have a context for some of the things that we can see within the context of the work that we do. So, without further ado, let us jump right in. Well, there is further ado, because if any of that stuff sounds great to you, please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel. And also, please check out my website at www.tarotdharma, TAROTDHARMA, tarotdharma.com. If you want to know a little bit more about my practice, or if you want to get a reading, or if you want to learn how to do horary astrology or tarot or any of the things that I offer on my website yourself. So please connect with me because I love hearing from people and I love hearing your feedback. And I definitely want to know what you have to say for the purpose of helping me grow this production of the True Divination podcast to even greater heights. So without further ado, here we go into the body of the chart. So here is the charts from my Aura files, and that is Oraculos Horary files. And the question is, should we marry? Now, the first thing that I think is important for us just to take into consideration as we move into any sort of astrology, really, but specifically horary astrology, is that we should have a means of entering the body of the chart. And this is a concept that I got from astrologer Robert Corey, who teaches the Moran method of horoscope analysis. And something that he said was that the issue with astrology isn't that within the chart there is too little information. The issue is that there is too much information. And it's kind of our duty as astrologers to curb our own enthusiasm from going after the thing that is most striking and most bold and most engaging, and pacing ourselves so that we can enter the landscape and the body of the chart in a way that is sensible, in a way that is stable, in a way that is consistent, and also in a way that bears a sense of sequential unfolding. Now, as I say this, things in the chart are connected. So you may start in one specific area. And as you move from that area into things that that area says about that component, you may find yourself looping in things from other areas based on planets that may be aspecting, based on houses that that planet may be ruling. And so you find yourself beginning to create a layered expression of the chart that you're actually reading. But at the end of the day, the important thing is still that we move into the body of the chart systematically, consciously, and in a way that doesn't make us feel sped up or a way that doesn't make us feel overwhelmed. And I'm reminded of something that Nikki Culpepper said, where he said that astrologers have to be really impartial people because too much love will cause us to magnify tiny essences of goodness that may not really be there. And too much hatred or too much disdain might cause us to magnify negative components that may not actually be as perilous as we might frame them. So his point was that we really have to be impartial as we move into the body of chart work. So that being said, the very first thing that I do when I look at a chart is I take a look at the sign that's rising. And we see that it is 22 degrees Libra, 18 minutes, and we see that there are all movable signs on all of the angles. And the movable is a name that the ancients gave to the cardinal signs. And if you go to Eastern astrology, Jyotish, Hindu astrology, they are also still using the term movable to describe these cardinal signs. Somewhere along the line, cardinal became the term that we used, and here we are. But here we see 22 degrees of Libra rising, 18 minutes, and it's a movable sign and movable signs on all of the angles. And I take that into consideration and I allow that to play in the background of my mind as a sort of general omen. And at this point, the general sense that I have just from looking at the angles is that if this is a situation where the person is desirous of movement, then movement is indicated just from the angles, because the angles kind of create a framework for the chart that we're actually reading. However, if this is a situation where the person is wanting stability and a sense of groundedness, that movement that's indicated may not necessarily be the best of things. Now, that is my way of going out on a limb, and that's about as far out on a limb as I ever go, because I realize that that isn't really a part of the classical literature, but it's something that I do in any event. Now, what's even more significant about 22 degrees Libra rising is that that is the rising area of what is known as the Via Combusta, or the flaming road within classical astrology. And today we consider the Via Combusta to span the distance of 15 degrees Libra to 15 degrees Scorpio, even though there are other traditions concerning the Via Combusta that view the Via Combusta as being from the degree of fall of the sun, which would be 19 degrees Libra, to the degree of fall of the moon, which would be 3 degrees Scorpio. But regardless, I think that it's safe to use the modern landmark of the Via Combusta, which is 15 degrees Libra to 15 degrees Scorpio. Because whether or not we choose to use those degrees or not, the signs of Libra and Scorpio do symbolize something fundamentally detrimental to the planets that give life. And I think this is the main piece that we have to take away from the Via Combusta. Because the question is, why is there a section of the zodiac called the Flaming Road? Or why is there a section of the zodiac where planets move through that is considered to be more perilous than any other section of the zodiac? And I was speaking to my mentor, Lee Lehman, about this. And she said something very illuminating about this Via Combusta area. She said that the Via Combusta is essentially the opposite to what the signs Aries and Taurus represent for the luminaries. So whereas Aries represents the place of exaltation of the sun, and Taurus represents the place of exaltation of the moon, the Via Combusta contains those two signs that are completely antithetical to the moon. Libra being the fall, or rather completely antithetical to the luminaries. Libra being the fall of the sun, and Scorpio being the fall of the moon. So whereas Aries and Taurus represent a life-producing, a life-engendering, productive, growth-oriented portion of the zodiac, the one sign being the beginning of spring, the second sign, Taurus, being the establishment of spring in its full glory, the Via Combusta represents a pathway of death, essentially. And while these two pathways, the pathway of life and the pathway of death, are pathways that are absolutely necessary for all of us to go through, we don't necessarily like to move through the valley of the shadow of death while we're still in the land of the living. And having the Via Combusta here rising on the ascendant is an indication of just that, that there is a sense of peril, that there is a sense of pain, that there is a sense of anguish related or relating to this question that we find as we move into the body of the question itself. Now, as I say this, I'm remembering that in modern Horary astrology, it's oftentimes said that this indication of the Via Combusta rising would be a judgment, or rather a stricture against judgment, i.e., the chart can't be read because the Via Combusta is rising. However, if we look at the classical literature, this term stricture against judgment was never a part of classical horary practice. When we read Lilly and when we read Gadbury and Culpeper and Blagrave and Mansforth and all of these classical authors, what they speak about are considerations before judgment, as in, if you see X sign rising on the horizon, proceed with caution because such and such an outcome may be indicated, or this may be an omen about the general nature of the chart itself. So, what we modernly consider to be strictures, or rather restrictions against judgment, weren't necessarily things that stopped the ancients from reading charts, because a chart is a chart is a chart, and all charts can be read, basically. So that's the first thing. But from the perspective of this being a consideration before judgment, the Via Combusta represents a perilous path of death for the luminaries. Now, I don't always speak up the Via Combusta in the way that I'm doing so right now, but what we find is that one of our two luminaries, the moon, is actively passing through the Via Combusta. So this only further illuminates this piece that there's a fundamental sense of pain and peregrination, i.e., a sense of being lost and confused for the querent as we enter the body of this reading. And for those of you new to Horary Astrology or divination in general, querent is the title that we give to the person asking the question. So that's our general consideration as we see the Via Combusta and the moon in the Via Combusta conjunct the ascendant, or rather sitting on top of the ascendant, is giving us a very focalized sense of pain and suffering and peregrination, which is a sense of roving, or a sense of wandering, or a sense of not having a place to call one's home. And those energies are associated with our entry point into the actual body of this chart. Now, moving on, the planet that rules the ascendant is Venus. And here we see we have essentially dignified Venus at 27 degrees Pisces, 55 minutes. So Venus is in her exaltation over here. And 27 degrees Pisces is the actual degree of exaltation for Venus. So here we have Venus in her most illustrious, most beautiful, most voluptuous sense of self. However, we see this Venus is in the cadent 6th house. And as we all know, the houses 6, 8, and 12 are considered to be the most abject parts of heaven, or rather, places where planets are severely debilitated for being there. The 6th house has a sense of severe debility because of its lack of connection to the ascendant, and actually, all of the houses, the 6th house, the 8th house, and the 12th house, are places of debility because of their lack of aspectual connection to the ascendant. So here we have our Venus in the 6th house, which is the house of slaves and slavery, and a place of general impoverishment, and also a place of sickness. So the querent, the Venus, though essentially dignified, she is in a state of accidental debility by being in the 6th house. Now, a useful thought that we could consider when we think about the 12 houses is that the angular houses, the 1st, the 4th, the 7th, and the 10th, they have the ability to enable a planet to show its maximum strength and potential for either good or ill. So to the angular houses, we can ascribe 100% of power. And then we go to the succedent houses, and it's a drop from the angular houses to the succedent houses. And from the houses 2, 5, 8, and 11, we can consider that planets there have the ability to show 50% of power. And from the succedent houses to the cadent houses, 3, 6, 9, and 12, we can consider that those are places where planets show the least amount of intrinsic strength themselves, and they're more or less dependent on environmental factors or other planetary aids to assist them in exerting their strength on the situation that we're asking about. Now, that's a very general concept that we can use in relation to the strengths that the houses bestow to planets. But all the same, Venus, essentially dignified, however accidentally debilitated in the sixth house, is, though fundamentally strong within herself, she is environmentally weakened, i.e., she may not have the ability to mobilize the strength from beyond herself in order to effect the change that she's seeking to effect within the question that she's asking about. Now, the ancients say something very peculiar about planets and their exaltation, because they basically all agree that a planet in its exaltation is like a man blowing air up his own ass. Because when you see a planet in its exaltation, it is a planet that puffs up its chest and that assumes more of itself than is its due. And that's me loosely paraphrasing Lily, but you'll find the same thing if you look in Nikki Culpeper. You'll find the same thing if you look extensively through the Renaissance and even into the medieval period, that a planet in its exaltation is a planet that has risen itself to a place of almost non-reality. When you think about what it is to be exalted, it's like, I am up here and I've risen myself to a place of non-reality because of the things I think about myself, when in fact, the truth of my own power may not be this great. And if faced with the first real dragon, I may curl and I may crumble and I may fall deeply within myself, because the power that I assume myself to have isn't a power based on an objective assessment of my current situation. And so with the Venus in the Pisces here at 27 Pisces 55 minutes, we see that this is a Venus who is definitely not attuned or aware of an objective sense of the situation that she herself is in. And it's not a good state of affairs. It's not a good state of affairs for her, because it isn't allowing her to see how potentially weak she actually is. Now, while she's in the exact degree of her exaltation, she's also coming towards the end of the sign Pisces. And after Venus leaves the sign of her exaltation, she begins a very uncomfortable sojourn through the sign of her detriment, which is Aries. So it stands to reason that while she may be floating on cloud nine, not fully aware of the truth of herself in relation to the question she's asking about, in a relatively short space of time, she's going to have a very harsh wake-up call or a very harsh dose of reality in relation to the question that she's asking about, which may lead her to believe, or which may lead her to the understanding that this union that you're trying to push forward with probably isn't even the best thing for you to begin with, because of the way in which you become debilitated as you move forward with this situation. Now, I know that I've seen in the literature that people say, well, hey, if you're in the sign of the person who you are trying to attract, or if you're in the sign or the house of the person who you love, then that's actually a good thing. But we have to think about that Venus's sojourn there. She is going to move into Aries, carrying still the sixth house sense of slavery with her. And furthermore, the sixth house in this chart is the 12th house of her lover, which means that her lover, seeing her there in his 12th house, which is the house of hidden enemies as well as the house of self-inflicted pain, he may not necessarily like the things that she's doing within his life, and neither may he necessarily like the effects that her presence within his life is having because of her association with the 12th house experiences that he himself may be trying to run away from. So, within the context of this reading, Venus entering the sign of Aries, i.e., the sign of her lover, which means she'll be under the dominion of her lover from the 12th house, or rather from his 12th house, and from a state of her own exaltation into a state of her most certain detriment, says that she's moving out of a place of partial discomfort because of the weakness that being in the sixth house brings. It brings a sense of not having power to affect your situation, even though you might be comfortable there being in exaltation. So she moves from a place of partial discomfort to a state of full-fledged discomfort as she moves into the sign of her detriment. So that's our general assessment of what the state of this Venus is by herself. And it isn't necessarily a state of planets associated with that Venus via aspect. It is just what this Venus is doing in and of herself, of her own accord. Now, we will move along to the planet that is significator of the person who she is asking the question about, i.e. the quasited. And we see Mars on the cusp of the seventh, which means that, or rather we see Aries on the cusp of the seventh, which means that Mars is ruler of the seventh house and thereby a significator of the quasited. Now, before I even go on into the body of this reading, I can't help but notice that Uranus is here in the seventh house as well. And Uranus in the seventh, there's an aphorism by Rupertus Stella in his book, The Astrologian's Guide to Horary Astrology, where he says that Uranus in the seventh house in questions related to marriage brings everything other than happiness in marriage. And it surely brings about the end of the marriage in the most bizarre and unexpected of ways. And he also says a point about Uranus in the seventh, representing a sense of dislike towards women or dislike of the person indicated by the seventh towards the woman, because he obviously assumes that the person asking the question will be a man. But he said that Uranus in the seventh not only indicates the dissolution of the relationship, but also a sense of dislike toward the woman or the other person involved in the relationship. Now, I am of two minds when it comes to just how far I can throw the outer planets and still have a sense of effectiveness. For instance, I believe that I would be more guided to Uranus as being a major interpretational factor of this if it was conjunct the seventh cusp. But all the same, is present within the seventh, and it's giving a flavor or an added flavor to what we've already said about this Venus at 27 degrees Pisces in the sixth. So it's already starting to take us in the direction of the path that we've already built, because we're building this composite image of the querent and the situation she's going through the sign that's rising, or rather the portion of the sign that's rising, which is the Via Combusta, through the querent's unrealistic sense of exaltation at 27 degrees Pisces, and to the very real sense of her accidental debility being in not only a cadent house, but in the sixth house. The sixth house, which with the 12th are the worst of the four cadent houses, the 3 and the 9, the third house and the ninth house not nearly being as bad as the two of them. So this Uranus piece is adding to the composite image that we're building about where this relationship is actually going. But Uranus isn't the main factor here. And the point is to move through the chart in a sequential manner. So we go from the ruler of the ascent, or the ruler of the descendant rather, which in this case is going to be Mars at 12 degrees Gemini, 19 minutes. Now, I know that Mars in Gemini is peregrine, hands down. But he's peregrine because he's not the domicile ruler there. He's peregrine because he's also not an exaltation ruler there. He's peregrine because he's not a triplicity ruler there, because this is a daytime chart, so the triplicity rulers of the air signs would be Saturn in the daytime, Mercury in the nighttime, and Jupiter as the participating triplicity ruler, none of whom is Mars. So we've knocked out the first three major categories of essential dignity. But then we have term. And so we have to see, does Mars have rulership in Gemini by term? Of course he does. Because the 5 planets, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, and Mercury, all have rulership within the 12 signs of the zodiac by term. Or some people call it bound as well. But we have to see, is Mars actually in his own terms? So I check and I say, in Gemini, we have Mercury ruling Gemini up until 7 degrees, followed by Jupiter ruling Gemini up until 13 degrees, followed by Venus ruling Gemini up until 21 degrees, followed by Saturn ruling Gemini up until 25 degrees, followed by Mars ruling Gemini up until the 30th degree. So just going through that check of Mars in terms of his term, Mars is not in his term at 12 degrees 90 minutes, because here Mars would be in the term of Jupiter. So he has no dignity by term either. Now the final thing is, does Mars have dignity by face? And Mars does have dignity by face because he rules no, it's not that. He doesn't rule the first face of Gemini. Mars is ruling the second face of Gemini. Jupiter rules the first face of Gemini, followed by Mars, followed by the Sun ruling the last face of Gemini. So here we have Mars in his own face in Gemini. But we have to go back to the literature, because what does the literature say to us about this? It says that a planet in its own face is like a man being thrown out of doors. A planet in its own face is like a man being thrown out of his house, or like a family on its last gasp, not knowing what to do with itself. So Mars does have the weakest level of dignity by having dignity in face, but he's like a man on his last gasp, being thrown out of doors into the coldness of the night. He might as well have been peregrine, truth be told. So, our quasited, the person who we're asking about, is in active shit shape, where the querent, the person asking the question, is in environmental shit shape. Even though, between you and me, a planet exalting itself is really, really not the ticket. So, he has dignity by face, but that's the weakest form of dignity possible. He's in a state of desperation and also a state of despair. Now, when I think about Mars and Gemini, I automatically think about someone having fire on the brain. I automatically think about someone moving in an erratic manner where they're not able to fully gather their powers into a way that actually allows them to be potent at anything. So even though Mars is in his face, I would still look at this Mars and consider him to be a planet peregrine, because Mars in Gemini does not have any of the tangible resources that allows it to put itself together and use its powers as Mars towards any specific end. So he's floundering, and he's floundering actively in the dark. Why do I say the dark? Because the ancients considered the eighth house to be one of the most abject houses of heaven, and I dare say that I've seen it probably in George Mansforth or someone like that, someone from the 17th, 18th century, who speaks about planets in the eighth house. When a planet is in the eighth house, this is a loose paraphrase. It might be Nikki Culpepper, actually. I'm not sure who it is, but I'll tell you guys in the next episode. But when a planet is in the eighth house without having any reason to be in the eighth house, the ancients say that it signifies a person in a state of despair, or it signifies a person in a state of deep fear and mental anguish. Now we have to ask ourselves, what would give a planet reason to be in the eighth house? And there are several reasons. One, a planet may be in the eighth house because it is ruler of that house, i.e., being ruler of the sign on the cusp of the eighth. But that's not even true, because here we see Taurus is on the cusp of the eighth house, and Taurus is one of the two signs of Mars's detriment, the other sign being Libra. So the Venus signs are the detriments of the Mars signs, and the Mars signs are the detriments of the Venus signs. So Mars has no purpose in this eighth house. He's floundering in the dark because the eighth house is also one of these abject houses of heaven. So he is also accidentally debilitated. Essentially, I'm itching to say essentially debilitated, but we technically can't say that because he does have dignity by being in face. But listen, if all the dignity I had was dignity by face, might as well just throw me in the chokey with Miss Trunchbull one time, because that's not any dignity I would want to have. So he is essentially weakly dignified by having dignity by face, but he is accidentally tormented as hell by being in the eighth house. Now, what's also significant about the eighth house is that the eighth house was classically considered to be a house of hell, or one of the two gates of Hades. Eighth house being Epicatophora, the entrance into hell, and the second house directly opposite the eighth house being Anaphora, the exit out of hell, because in the words of John Gadbury, because everything that doth rise from the second house rises towards the ascendant. So the eighth house is our entryway into the valley of the shadow of death, whereas the second house is our exit point out of the valley of the shadow of death. Both of which are absolutely, positively, unequivocally, actually, let me take that back before I finish it. One of which is absolutely, positively, unequivocally awful, because I'd rather be coming out of hell, thank you very kindly, than going into hell. And here we have Mars very much going into hell. So he's desperate, he's confused, he is lost, he has no ability to pour himself into anyone because of the general state of his own personal affairs. And here is Venus down here feeling more beautiful than beauty itself, because if you know the story of Venus, Venus sprung from the severed penis of her dismembered father, and she rose out of the foams of the oceans. So here is Venus feeling as if there's never been a woman as beautiful as me before. There's never been anyone as lovely or as intoxicating as me before. So how can you, O Mars, deny me thy beauty? But when Mars looks from one hellish landscape into another hellish landscape, the sixth house being the house of his own self undoing, and he sees her there is nothing that he sees within her that can endear her to him. And there's also nothing that he sees within her that can make him yearn for her affection. Because here we definitely don't see him yearning for the affection that she has to give. So this is the general state of affairs between the two of them. Now, while she may feel as if she's sitting in the hot seat or in the hotbed of love itself, he has love as the furthest thing from his mind, because he is here moving through a field of death and terror. Now, when it comes to horaries and putting significators in alternate houses, what we find is that while this is the eighth house of the radix chart or of the radical chart, this is his second house, i.e., he, Mars, has the seventh house as his first house, and therefore the eighth house would be his second house, i.e., the house of his own money. Now, what does it mean for Mars to be essentially peregrine? And I know that there are people rolling their eyes because he's not peregrine. Okay, so fine, people, he's not peregrine, but essentially weakly dignified and accidentally debilitated, and having a dignity that feels like a curse, being only dignified by being in face. What does it mean for this Mars to be not peregrine, but what does it mean for this Mars to have weak essential dignity by face in his own second house? It could mean that he is fundamentally worried about money. Or it could mean that money is the source of his true concern and not necessarily her. So money could be an indication of what he's actually worried about. He's actually worried about his liquid assets and the way in which he can sustain himself by those liquid assets in the world. Raw, cold, hard cash. So this would be the two interpretations for this eighth house, and why he himself would be present there within it. Now, before we move towards casting our final judgment about the matter, I look to see if there are any other peculiar things within the body of the chart itself. And as I look around, I think I should very well explain what this is. This symbol right here is the part of spirit. So we have the part of fortune down here in the sixth house as well. And we also have the part of spirit here in the seventh house. That is what that is. I always put the part of spirit in. I always put it in when I do natal work, because I feel as if it works in a very similar way to the part of fortune. And I also put it in when I do any horary work in general, also because I feel as if it represents a place of concern for a person. And one of my mentors, Judith Hill, has referred to the part of fortune specifically as a place of happiness for a person. So I just view the part of spirit as a place of additional happiness or a place of major concern for the person who is asking the question. And here we see her part of spirit is in this seventh house, i.e., the house of the quasited, i.e., the house of this man who she's trying to marry. So her main and singular concern at this time is being in this man's life. Her main and singular concern at this time is affecting a marriage between the two of them. But is marriage between the two of them really possible? Or rather, should we marry? Which is the question. Based on her state of affairs, based on his state of affairs, the answer seems to be no. But let's move deeper within the body of the chart to see what else we can get. Now, because this is a daytime chart, I take a look at the Almuten rulers of both the first house and the second house. And in the daytime, Venus isn't the ruler of the first house. Venus isn't the ruler of Libra, rather Saturn is. And in the daytime, Mars isn't the ruler of Aries, rather the Sun is. And there has been a squabble amongst ancient astrologers that says that if an Almuten ruler is potentially doing stronger than the actual sign ruler, then that is an argument that we should use the Almuten ruler to represent the querent and the quasited and not necessarily the sign ruler. Or rather, we should use the Almuten ruler as a co-ruler of the querent and the quasited and not necessarily the sign ruler. Now, I've always kind of stood on the fence about that because we have a very specific story that's being told by our Venus and Mars as the prime significators of both the querent and the quasited. And I've always believed that to bring in additional factors where a very clear story has already been told, it only serves the purpose of muddying our interpretation or muddying the crispness of our interpretation. And I recently heard Gary Kristen say this in a lecture of his where he pretty much told the audience or warned the audience against overworking a chart. Because when we overwork a chart, what ends up happening is that everything just turns brown at the end of the day. Everything, instead of being this rich, multifaceted, multicolored expression of a living reality, when we bring in too many moving parts, everything turns brown, in a sense. Brown and as thick and as dumb as mud. However, for the sake of bringing it in, just to show how this could potentially be used, let us assume that Saturn, essentially dignified Saturn in Capricorn and thus in the sign of his domicile, represents the Almuten, or rather is a co-representative of Lord 1. And let us assume that the Sun, essentially dignified in Aries, being in the sign of his exaltation, is a co-ruler, or rather is a co-representative of Lord 7. Now, when I use the Almutens together, I use them together. So I would never start talking about the relationship of this Saturn to this Mars or the relationship of this Venus to this Sun solely for the purpose of using the traditional rulers in one regard together, complete until the very end of my judgment, and then bringing in the Almuten rulers in another regard or as a secondary look at the entire image of the thing to bring in an overtone or an undertone to that judgment. But I would never do Saturn to Sun, or rather, I would never do Saturn to Mars or Venus to Sun. Now, for those of you who follow William Lilly, you know that there is a reason for us to use Venus and Sun as significators of the man in the question, or rather as significators of the woman in the question and the man in the question, respectively, if we are speaking about a heterosexual marriage situation. But we're going to push that aside because that is definitely moving in the direction of creating a situation that is as dumb as mud. For all intents and purposes, let's look at the Saturn and the Sun. Now, Saturn, while essentially dignified by being in his domicile and by being strong through being in the fourth house, he is accidentally debilitated through his conjunction, or rather through his application to the dragon's tail, Cauda Draconis, the south node. Now, I don't know if I've said this before, and I must have, but the south node in general is like a toilet bowl. Within the context of Western astrology, the south node is a toilet bowl because we have this north node, which is the dragon's head, i.e., the place where the dragon eateth, and we have the south node, the dragon's tail, i.e., the place where the dragon shitteth. So here we have Saturn, who's already groveling and rising up from the mud, as is the nature of Saturn, applying to the south node, which is the cesspool of everything that the dragon has released from his body. And we have an essentially very bad Saturn, because the south node takes away any power or any goodness that that Saturn could have about itself. So any effectiveness or any energy that that Saturn might have in the direction of affecting an outcome is already taken from him, simply by virtue of the fact of his being so close and so joined to that south node. Now, we could say, but the Saturn is strong by being in the fourth house. When we see the ancients talk about the houses, they always say that, well, depends on who you go to. The first house is either going to be the strongest house, or the 10th house is going to be the strongest house. So we have this swapping between the first house and the 10th house as being the strongest houses, followed by the 7th house, followed by the 4th house. So I've always considered the 4th house, in a sense, to be the cadent house of the angular houses. And what that means is that of the 4 angles, the 4th house has the least ability to do anything that we might consider to be positive in terms of affecting an outcome. Furthermore, if this were a situation of her wanting to create a sense of union with him, what we also find is that her being represented by Saturn, or rather she being represented by Saturn, does not have the ability to create a union with anyone, because within classical Horary astrology, we're only using the classical planets of the Chaldean order, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, Sun, Venus, Mercury, Moon, to indicate the ability, or to have the ability to be significators of the querent or the quasitive. So Saturn in this context does not have the ability to apply to anyone, especially not the Sun. Now, what is their relationship? Saturn has more of a grounded relationship to the situation. It's in the fourth house. It's thinking about creating things rooted in lastingness. It's thinking about creating things that have a sense of eternity attached to it. It's thinking about creating something that's going to stand the test of time, which is what we would want a marriage to be. However, we have Sun over here in Aries, a, another another friend and mentor of mine, Christine Skinner. She speaks about the Sun in Aries as being like a Tarzan. So here we have homeboy over here, Sun in Aries, as Tarzan, not necessarily wanting to be bound by anything that Saturn is potentially interested in. So, and what are the things that Saturn is interested in? Well, Saturn is interested in our house and home. What is the thing that homeboy over here is interested in? He is interested in himself. He is interested in himself, which further goes back to what we initially said about Mars being ruler of the seventh house, i.e., Mars in a state of only having only having dignity by face. He is concerned about his own survival, and the Sun in Aries is a further testament to that. Furthermore, any relationship that the Sun and Saturn would have had would have been through the Sun applying to Saturn, but here we see the Sun having already separated from Saturn by 8 degrees. And furthermore, what type of aspect are they separating from? They're separating from a square. Now, Guido Bonatti has something to say about the relationship of planets that are square to each other. And it's in the beginning of his book. Actually, I'll hold up the book. It's in the beginning of this book, Bonatti on Horary, and this is a translation by Dr. Benjamin Dykes. If you haven't bought any of Ben Dykes's translations and you're an astrologer and you're an aspiring classical astrologer, you are absolutely missing out, because when I cracked open this book, it literally brought me to tears because of how clear and how clean not only the translation is, but also how clear and how clean Guido Bonatti's voice is coming to us over hundreds and hundreds of years of time. So anyway, this is what the inside of my copy looks like. Well, hold on. There, it is highly, as you can see, highly, there's not a page really that doesn't have me, oh Lord, that's just a mess. But there's not a page that doesn't have some highlight. Oh, well, there are pages with no highlighting. But anyway, there's not really a page with no highlighting because there is so much in this book that is crucial to how I operate as a horary astrologer. So what Bonatti says about planets, or rather significators of a question having relationships to each other only by square, is that when significators are connected through a square without reception, it is similar to an opposition with reception. And actually, I'll read the thing. He says, on those matters which come to be with striving, effort, and labor. However, those which come to be with striving and effort and obstacles and labor and great trouble are when the significator of the querent is joined with the significator of the quesited matter by opposition or by a square aspect without reception. So what we see already is that even if they had the ability to have any sort of application between them, it would be an application through a square without reception, which is a stressful, striving, obstacle-ridden relationship. And it's like, damn, if we had to fight that hard to be in this relationship, like, is this a relationship that even needs to happen at all? And chances are it's not. Now, that would be the relationship between the Saturn and the Sun. Other thing about that Sun is that the Sun is coming to the very end of his sojourn through Aries. And there's an interesting thing that the Vedic astrologers say about the last degrees in masculine signs. And this is also something that I got from my mentor, Judith Hill, who first brought this to my attention. Even though it's also something that's in Beth M's Centiloquim as well. But Beth M says that a planet in the last degrees of any sign, or a planet in the last degrees of a sign where he has dignity, is like a man leaving from home, i.e., going on a voyage, i.e., going into a state or a realm where he has no essential power of its own. However, what Judith told me was that within the Hindu tradition, planets in the final degrees of masculine signs are thought to be dead, insofar as they have no power. So here we have a Sun in the final degrees of his masculine sign Aries having no power. And if my memory serves me correctly, I believe that even in the Hindu tradition, the Sun here is thought to be, or the Sun in Aries is thought to be in the most splendid part of the zodiac where he could potentially ever be, even more splendid than his own sign, Leo. But here we have a Sun that's dying and is actively moving out of Aries and into the sign of Taurus, where the Sun has no dignity whatsoever. Let me check that in my mind. Sun in Taurus, no dignity whatsoever. The Sun is absolutely peregrine during his entire sojourn through Taurus. So therefore, Saturn, our lady friend, is weak circumstantially by being joined to the South Node, as well as by being in the fourth house, which is strong, but it's weak compared to other places where Saturn could be. It's also weak insofar as the decision to make something happen in this relationship isn't going to be Saturn's to make, but it's going to be the faster moving planet, i.e., the Sun's to make. And it seems as if the Sun has already made that decision and has already moved away from this relationship at the very minimum 8 days prior to this reading even being given. Now, why do I say 8 days prior to this reading being given? Because we see that the Sun at 28 degrees Aries separated from that Saturn at 20 degrees Capricorn within 8 degrees. And movable signs in cardinal houses denote the least amount of time for something to have happened. And so we typically consider that to be days. But based on the scale or the scope of a question, it could be more than days, it could probably be weeks, or it could even be months. But the main point is that given the reality of a situation, movable signs in cardinal houses will denote the quickest unit of time that an event may have happened or potentially will happen. So, Sun removed from Saturn by 8 degrees leads me to the thought of 8 movable time units, which in my opinion is 8 days. Now, that's if we were to use Saturn and Sun as Almuten rulers. It seemed as if it was a bad relationship and it's already over. Now, phew, thank goodness we're not using Saturn and Sun as the main significators of the querent. So let's go and see if hope springs eternal for our querent and the quaesited themselves by virtue of the first house lord and the seventh house lord. Again, we see a relationship by square, and most definitely, let's see, 27 degrees of Pisces is the final decan of Pisces, which is ruled by Mars. So Venus is in the Mars decan. Okay. Final degree, final degrees of Pisces. Let's see, is that the term of Mars? Mm-mm-mm. Venus is also no. Venus is in the terms of Saturn. Because if memory serves me correctly, which I think it does, Venus rules up until 8 degrees of Pisces. So the terms of Venus in Pisces would be 8 degrees of Pisces, and then Jupiter would rule up to 14 degrees of Pisces, Mercury ruling up to 20 degrees of Pisces, Mars ruling up to 26 degrees of Pisces, and Saturn ruling up to 30 degrees of Pisces. So Venus at 27 degrees Pisces is in the term of Saturn, though she's in the face of Mars. And then the final piece would be, is she in the triplicity of Mars? This is a daytime chart, so the daytime ruler of water signs would be Venus. So no, she's not even in the triplicity of Mars. So we cannot consider this Venus and this Mars to be having a sense of reception between them. And I think earlier I had said that Mars himself was neither in the triplicity of Venus or the term of Venus or the face of Venus. So neither of them really have any reception between them. But reception notwithstanding, there's no aspect there. Because Mars is at 12 degrees, Venus is at 27 degrees. So is there the ability of one to apply to the other? The answer is most assuredly no. And if they were applying to each other, they would end up in the same situation as what we have between the Sun and Saturn, being planets that apply to each other without having, what is the term? Or planets that apply to each other by a square aspect. So it would have been a square without reception, and therefore a state of striving, and a state of suffering, and a state of climbing uphill, and a state of reaching and wondering whether or not this is something we should be doing in the first place, because it's requiring so much effort on our part. So by time as we actually reach to a level that allows us to enjoy the fruits of our labor, we're battered and we're torn and we're confused and we're wondering whether or not we should have actually fought so hard for it in the first place, which really and truthfully isn't the basis upon which any relationship should be built. Now, that for me is the fullness of what I would say about this reading for this lady regarding the question, should we marry? My final judgment regarding this would be, no, my dear, do not marry. Because this marriage seems to be the very thing that's going to lead not only you deeper into a state of suffering, but also him deeper into a state of suffering. And truthfully, whether you may actively acknowledge it or not, the two of you have already shifted gears from being in the body of this relationship. Now, what I'm just seeing now that I didn't see then was that we have the moon square the nodes. And she's square the nodes in the exact degree of the nodes. Now, while I know that what I'm about to say is something that is considered to be a modern concept in horary astrology, I've seen it doing very strange things in horary charts before that I think is worth mentioning. Because when planets that are significators are also in the degree of the nodes, it indicates a sense of fatedness is the word. And I don't remember who actually says this. Maybe it's Ivy Jacobson Goldstein, maybe it's Barbara Waters, but I think it's one of them, that the degree of the nodes is a degree of fate, but it can also be a degree of tragedy. And here we have the moon, who is co-significator of the querent in every question, and I dare say co-significator of the question itself in the degree of the nodes at the exact squaring place of the nodes at a full moon, no less. So let's just stand back for a second before we come to the conclusion of this and really take a look at what's going on. We have moon in the degree of the nodes, squaring the nodes, conjunct the ascendant on a full moon. There's something powerfully mythological about that. That seems like this is a turning point of macrocosmic proportions. It seems as if the story being told in this chart is a story of legendary proportions, because it doesn't just seem like this person is unfolding a story personal to themselves. It seems like this person is unfolding a myth, because that is how big this relationship of the nodes to the full moon to the angle seems to be. And all of the angles, as we can see, are also in the degree of the nodes. And I think there is something to be said when a chart reveals back to us that our personal story has taken on an energy and a momentum and a sense of weight that makes it much larger than our personal story. There's something to be said of when our stories go beyond our stories and go into the realm of archetypal myths. Because there can be, in my personal opinion, looking at this now, there can be no greater undercurrent for transformation and destruction and ending of one cycle and beginning of another cycle than this that we're seeing here. Not only that, we see that it's a full moon chart and the sun is setting and the moon is rising. And we see Pluto conjunct the IC. So while I am pulling in various pieces of the chart to bring it into a more cohesive whole at this moment, it seems as if this sense of subterranean, transformational, destructive power is fundamental to this reading itself. And perhaps if I had stepped back and looked at the chart from a bird's eye view and really taken into consideration the setting sun, the rising moon, the full moon, moon in the degrees of the nodes, angles in the degrees of the nodes, Pluto on the IC, I would have gotten to the conclusion a lot quicker. But I want for you to see how everything ties into everything and how at the end of the day, all of the pieces of the chart, they're working together and they're giving a very specific answer to the question that this lady is asked of should we marry? The answer to which I would have given would have been no. So that's about it for this chart. What I love about Horary Astrology is the way in which it can take the contents of our personal situation and move it beyond the sphere of our personal lives and show us that same situation from a cosmic perspective. Because it's one thing for us to go through our own stuff by ourselves, but it's a completely different thing when we see our stuff magnified against the backdrop of the stars. It adds a sense of meaning, it adds a sense of purpose to the struggles or the challenges or even the joys we may be going through. And it also adds a sense of us being seen and heard and felt and acknowledged, because it may acknowledge aspects of our situation that even we aren't willing to acknowledge. And when that happens, it allows something to solidify within us that allows us to realize that even though the situation feels utterly awful, it's awful with a meaning, or it's awful with the purpose of guiding me back to myself and really letting me see who I am and where I am truthfully from an objective perspective so that I can make the most objective decision about how I'm going to liberate myself to live my best life possible. And I think that that's what divination as a whole does for all of us. It allows us to rise above the fickle pieces of the stories that we find ourselves a part of. And it allows for us to see those stories against a cosmic star field. It allows us to see the stories of our lives projected onto a backdrop of 1,000 stars. And through seeing ourselves in this way, we have the ability to make greater and more informed decisions about how exactly we're going to move forward and how exactly we see forward movement in light of everything else that's occurred. So for that reason, I think that Horary Astrology is really still a vital part of our toolbox as astrologers. And I completely agree with so many of my colleagues who say that Horary Astrology is probably really the first branch of astrology we should learn, because it trains your mind in a certain way that allows you to approach your natal astrology with greater depth and insight, to approach your mundane astrology with greater depth and insight, and to approach all branches of your astrological practice with a greater sense of knowledge and wisdom. Because after you've seen 1,000 horary charts, you begin to realize, what does a good chart look like? What does a bad chart look like? What does the story of this chart look like before I even dive into the specifics of it? And what can I say to a person automatically based on the things that are blatantly obvious? So if you've never studied horary astrology, probably now is the best time to start, because horary can teach you how to be with astrology in a way that I don't think any other branch of astrology has ever taught me. But that's also just my personal situation. Anywho, there was another thing I wanted to do with that chart, and it's something that my dear friend um, Tony Lewis, who wrote the book Horary Astrology Plain and Simple. He and I, we've been getting together for the past few Fridays and just going over some astro talk, being complete astro nerds together. And he said to me that Evangeline Adams, who was one of the pioneering astrologers in the early 1900s, I think, he said Evangeline Adams, what she would do with horary astrology was she would take the person's natal planets and she would adjust the house cusps for the moment that the question is asked, but she would use the exact same natal planets of that person in their natal positions in order to answer the question that the person is asking. And we did that over a few charts, and the results were absolutely astounding in the most phenomenal and amazing of ways. So while I didn't have the natal information for this chart, the next few charts that I have in mind, I definitely do have the natal information for those. So slowly but surely, I'm going to be coming out with that content so that you guys could see just what that aspect of horary can be like as well, where we take the cusps of the moment the question is asked, but use our natal positionings of our planets in that chart to answer basically any question we'd ask. So I can't wait to get more into that and to test it out on a couple charts with you guys. So thank you so much for spending this time with me. I always shoot for these recordings to be no longer than 30 minutes, 25 minutes. And I'm long-winded to a fault actually, and so I'm going to try to curb my enthusiasm on the upcoming recordings. But thank you guys so much for tuning in and for supporting the podcast and for listening and for sticking around until the very end. And I really do hope that there's something that you're getting from this in terms of an education that can assist you in your own journey with divination or your own journey with horary astrology, because nothing else would make my heart sing more than to know that people are actually learning from the Oraculo's True Divination podcast. Anywho, that is all for today. Once again, if you enjoyed what you saw or heard here, please like and subscribe. Why do people say subscribe? Please like and subscribe to my YouTube channel by clicking on the link below. And also check out my website at www.tarot, T-A-R-O-T, Dharma, D-H-A-R-M-A, tarotdharma.com to find out more about my practice and to find out how you could learn with me, get a reading from me, talk to me, connect with me. And I definitely want to connect with all of you. So that is a wrap, and the sun is setting outside, which means I had better haul tail home. So, from the bottom of my heart, thank you guys so much for spending this time with me. I definitely do love you very much. And until next time, be well. Have a good one. Bye.